Look at any big building made in the 1800s. Not the simple wooden houses or basic brick homes. I'm talking about the huge exhibition halls, the World's Fair buildings, the fancy government buildings that are in our city centers today. Now ask yourself a simple question. How did they power these huge buildings? The official answer is gas lighting and candles, maybe some early electric experiments in the 1880s and 90s. But here's what doesn't make sense. These buildings covering many city blocks with thousands of lights, fancy fountains, fancy moving machines, were supposedly lit up by gas lamps and taken care of by, what, an army of lamplighters running up and down ladders every evening? Let's use some basic thinking here. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago covered 690 acres. Official history tells us it had over 100,000 light bulbs, making it the first all-electric fair. But wait, this was only 14 years after Edison's first working bulb. We're asked to believe that within 10.5 years, people went from basic carbon wire bulbs that lasted 40 hours to a power system smart enough to light up an entire city-sized place? The setup alone would have needed miles of copper wiring, huge generators, and power-sharing systems that supposedly didn't exist yet. But here's what the photographs show us, and this is where the official story begins to fall apart. Look at the pictures from the 1893 Chicago Fair, the 1889 Paris Exposition, the Crystal Palace in London from 1851. Look at the tall metal tops, the towers, the fancy metal frames reaching high into the air. Official history calls these decorative pieces or fancy designs. But what if we've been looking at them wrong this entire time? What if these weren't decorations at all, but working parts of a power system that's been purposely erased from our history books? The buildings of the 1800s weren't just amazing buildings, they were machines, and the proof is hiding in plain sight. Let's start with what we can see directly in thousands of photographs from the 1800s. Every major city building, church, exhibition hall, and government building had the same basic design parts. Huge metal spires, copper or gold-covered domes, fancy metal fencing and railings, fancy iron frames reaching upward, and perhaps most telling, decorative metal balls and pointed tops placed at the highest points of every important building. Official history tells us these were purely for looks.
That architects of the 1800s simply all loved Gothic and neoclassical decoration. But this explanation falls apart when you look closely. Think about the Cathedral of St. Paul in London, finished in 1710, but heavily fixed up throughout the 1800s. The dome is topped with a huge golden cross and ball. The entire building is 365 feet tall, 1 foot for each day of the year, we're told. But why is the cross hollow? Why does it have an internal metal frame inside? Official explanations mention lightning protection, but the design is way more complicated than a simple lightning rod. The ball itself is made of copper, covered in gold, and connected through a fancy network of metal wires that run throughout the building structure. Now let's look bigger. The Paris Opera House, finished in 1875. At its top sits a fancy golden lyre, the symbol of Apollo, god of light. The lyre is made entirely of copper and gold-colored bronze. But here's what's interesting. The Opera House plans show that metal wires run from this lyre down through the building's frame, connecting to a huge network of pipes and tubes that, official historians claim, were only for gas lighting. Yet the building complexity is ridiculous if we're only talking about gas pipes. Why would you need copper wires for gas pipes? Why the specific use of metals that conduct electricity at the highest points? Let's take this investigation further. The United States Capitol building had major fixes in the 1850s and 60s. The cast iron dome was topped with the Statue of Freedom in 1863, 5 feet tall and weighs 15,000 pounds. It's placed at the absolute highest point of the building, 288 feet above the ground. Official history says this was a symbolic move, representing the Union's victory in the Civil War. But look at the building details. The statue is hollow and has an internal metal frame. It sits on top of a cast iron dome that's connected to a complicated network of metal supports running throughout the building. The statue itself conducts electricity, placed to catch electricity from the atmosphere. This pattern repeats with scary consistency across the world. The Royal Exhibition Building in Melbourne, Australia, built for the 1880 International Exhibition, has a central dome topped with fancy metalwork reaching skyward.
The Sacré-Cœur Basilica in Paris started in 1875, topped with a Byzantine-style dome covered in white stone, but supported by a fancy metal frame that goes through the entire building. The Philadelphia City Hall, finished in 1901 but designed in the 1870s, topped with a statue of William Penn, standing on top of a fancy tower that serves as the highest point in the city for decades. Again, metal on metal on metal, all serving as conductors. What are we really looking at here? Let's look at the spires more carefully. The Chicago World's Fair buildings had fancy metal frames coming from every major building. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts building alone had multiple towers and spires, all made of iron and steel, all reaching toward the sky. The Transportation building had a huge arched entrance covered in gold and surrounded by metal decoration. The Electricity building, ironically named, was covered in metal conductors and had multiple points of catching electricity from the air. But here's where it gets interesting. The official photographs show something strange. Many of these buildings appear to be giving off light from within, glowing with a brightness that seems way too bright and steady for gas lamps. Some photographs show what appears to be a fog or mist around the tallest spires, especially during evening hours. This effect is usually dismissed as photo mistakes or simple fog, but look at the pattern. The fog appears most strongly around the metal parts, the spires, the domes, the fancy frames. The technology was hiding in plain sight, disguised as decoration. Now, let's talk about what else these buildings had in common, something that official history barely talks about. They were all connected to water. The Paris Exposition had huge fountains. The Chicago Fair was built directly on the shores of Lake Michigan, with water features throughout the grounds. The Crystal Palace in London had the most fancy fountain system of its time, with jets of water shooting 40 feet into the air. World's fairs across Europe had canals, pools, fake waterfalls, and reflecting pools as central design parts. Official history says these were decorative, but water conducts electricity. Specifically, water with dissolved minerals in it, which all public water sources have, is an excellent conductor of electricity. These weren't decoration, they were part of the power-sharing system. Think about the details that official history asks us to accept.
The 1893 Chicago Fair operated for 6 months. It had electric lights, moving walkways, thousands of exhibits with moving parts, fancy theatrical presentations, and hosted 27 million visitors. We're told this was powered by steam-generated electricity from the Westinghouse system. But let's do the math. To generate the electricity needed for the fair's official 100,000 light bulbs, each using roughly 50 watts, you'd need 5 megawatts of continuous power. Steam generators of that time could produce roughly 100 to 200 kilowatts each. This means the fair would have needed 25 to 50 huge steam generators running constantly, burning coal around the clock. The amount of coal needed would be huge, potentially hundreds of tons per day. Yet photographs of the fair show minimal smoke, clean white buildings, and no proof of the huge coal storage and delivery systems that would have been necessary. The math doesn't work, unless there was another power source entirely. Let's shift our investigation to focus on what scientists of the 1800s actually understood about electricity, because it's far more than we've been led to believe. Official history teaches us that electrical technology was basic in the 1800s. Edison's bulb in 1879, Tesla's alternating current developments in the 1880s and 90s, Marconi's radio experiments at the turn of the century. We're given the impression of steady, straight progress from not knowing to understanding. But this story ignores decades of earlier research and real uses. Benjamin Franklin's famous kite experiment was in 1752. He showed that lightning was electricity and that it could be caught. But what we're rarely taught is what happened next. Throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s, scientists across Europe were experimenting with catching electricity from the atmosphere, not as a curiosity, but as a real power source. In 1838, Carl Friedrich Gauss and Wilhelm Weber showed long-distance electrical communication in Germany. They built a telegraph system that sends signals across Göttingen using the Earth itself as a conductor. This was 11 years before Samuel Morse's better-known telegraph system. The key discovery? They realized the Earth had a natural electrical potential that could be tapped and used. Let me take this further. In the 1840s and 50s, scientists noticed that buildings struck by lightning sometimes had strange electrical effects for days or weeks afterward. Metal fixtures would give off sparks.
Compasses would behave strangely. Water pipes would become electrically charged. Official science dismissed these as temporary oddities. But what if they were proof of something else? That buildings could catch and store electrical charges from the atmosphere.
Now, look again at those metal spires and domes covering every major building of the 1800s. Look at the copper roofing materials, the gold covering, the fancy metal frames. These are all excellent electrical conductors, and they're all placed to maximize surface area exposed to the atmosphere. But the system was more complicated than simple lightning rods. The key lies in understanding the Earth's electrical field. At any given moment, there's a voltage difference between the Earth's surface and the upper atmosphere of roughly 300,000 volts. This creates a constant electrical field of about 100 volts per meter in fair weather. During storms or atmospheric disturbances, this field increases dramatically. This isn't guessing, this is measurable, documented atmospheric physics that modern science fully admits. Now, here's the question official history never addresses. If the scientists of the 1800s understood this, and they did, why wouldn't they try to harness it? The proof suggests they did exactly that, and the technology was built directly into the architecture. Look at the building details of major 1800s buildings. The metal frames weren't just sitting on the surface. They were built into the structure, connected through networks of metal conductors and pipes that ran throughout the buildings. Official historians claim these were for gas lighting, for structural support, for water distribution. But look at the materials used. Copper piping when iron would have been cheaper. Brass fixtures when wood or ceramic would have been enough. Gold and silver covering on architectural parts that never needed such expensive treatments for purely looks purposes. These buildings were designed as huge atmospheric electrical collectors and distributors. The tall spires and towers served as collection points, maximizing exposure to the atmospheric electrical field. The metal domes and roofing materials increased surface area and conductivity. The fancy metalwork, the pointed tops, the decorative balls, the fancy metal fencing, all served as additional collection points and conductors. And the internal network of metal pipes and fixtures shared this power throughout the building. But it gets better.
The water features weren't just decoration. They were an essential part of the system. Water, especially when flowing and full of air bubbles as in fountains, generates significant electrical charges through a process called the waterfall effect, or Lenard effect. As water droplets break apart and fall, they separate electrical charges, creating a natural electrical field. This is why you often feel refreshed near waterfalls. You're literally being surrounded by negative ions generated by the moving water. The huge fountains of the 1800s weren't decorative. They were power generators, creating electrical charges that could be collected by the metal frames of the surrounding buildings. And the reflecting pools weren't just mirrors, they were storage systems, huge reservoirs of electrified water that could buffer and share power across the exhibition grounds. Now, let's look at specific case studies to see this system in action. The 1889 Paris Exposition had the Eiffel Tower as its centerpiece. Standing 1,083 feet tall, it was the tallest man-made structure in the world. Official history tells us it was built as a show of French engineering skill, serving no real function. But this makes no sense. 5 million rivets? It used huge resources and labor. Why build something so costly if it served only as decoration? Unless it wasn't decoration at all. The Eiffel Tower is a huge metal conductor, placed to maximize exposure to atmospheric electricity. Its lattice frame provides maximum surface area while minimizing weight. At its peak, it had an apartment and laboratory used by Gustave Eiffel himself, a perfect position for doing electrical experiments. And surrounding the tower at its base were fancy fountains and water features, powered by what official history vaguely describes as hydraulic systems. But there's more. The tower was equipped with electric lights from the very beginning, thousands of them. Official history credits this to Edison's new electrical technology, but the setup doesn't match this explanation. There are no visible huge generators, no photographs of coal-burning power plants supplying the tower, no proof of the electrical distribution systems that would have been necessary using conventional technology of the time. What if the tower was itself the power system?
Atmospheric electricity collected by the huge iron structure, stored and buffered through the water systems at its base, distributed through the electrical grid to light itself and the surrounding exhibition grounds. The proof is there in the photographs. The tower glowing at night, surrounded by lit fountains, with no visible conventional power source. Let's move beyond observation and dive into the numbers, because this is where the official story completely falls apart. I want you to think about what we're told about building capabilities in the 1800s. These were societies that, according to official history, still relied primarily on horse-drawn transportation, manual labor, and relatively basic industrial techniques. Yet somehow, these same societies built buildings of extraordinary sophistication and scale in impossibly short timeframes. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair buildings were built in approximately 2 years. Let me emphasize this. 2 years to build an entire city of huge, fancy buildings covering 690 acres. The main manufacturers and liberal arts building alone was 1,687 feet long and 787 feet wide, with a roof that covered 44 acres. It was the largest building in the world at the time. Let's do some simple math here. The manufacturer's building needed roughly 17 million board feet of lumber, 12 million pounds of iron and steel, and huge amounts of glass, plaster, and decorative materials. Official history tells us this was built in less than 2 years by a workforce of approximately 10,000 men. That's 1,700 board feet of lumber per worker over 2 years. 3 board feet of lumber every single day, along with iron, steel, glass, and finishing materials. And that's assuming every single worker was involved in materials handling, with no time for design, supervision, specialized tasks, or any of the 1,000 other requirements of a construction project of this scale. The timeline is impossibly difficult using the technology officially available in 1893. But it gets worse when you look at the level of detail and craftsmanship. The buildings weren't simple structures. They had fancy plasterwork, complicated metal decoration, smart electrical wiring, complex water systems, and highly detailed decorative parts that would have required skilled craftsmen working for months or years. Yet official photographs show these buildings going from bare ground to completion in a matter of months. How?
How is this possible using hand tools, manual labor, and horse-drawn equipment? Unless the buildings weren't entirely new construction. Unless they were built using techniques and technologies that official history has erased from the record. Let's look at another impossibility. The power requirements we've already touched on, but let's break it down further. The 1900 Paris Exposition had 83,000 exhibitors and attracted 15 million visitors over 7 months. It was lit by what official sources claim were 10,000 light bulbs and 5,000 arc lamps. Arc lamps of this time used roughly 500 to 1,000 watts each. 5 to 5 megawatts just for the arc lighting, plus another 500 kilowatts for the light bulbs. 5 megawatts of continuous power demand. Steam generators of 1900 might produce 500 kilowatts each under best conditions. You'd need 6 to 11 huge generators running continuously. Each generator would need several tons of coal per day. Over 7 months, you're looking at thousands of tons of coal that needed to be delivered, stored, and burned. The smoke alone from this operation would have been visible for miles and would have covered the entire exposition in a layer of soot. Yet photographs show perfect white buildings, clean grounds, and minimal proof of industrial power generation. The math simply doesn't support the official story. Now let's address the even bigger question, the question that official history desperately avoids. What happened to all these incredible buildings? The Chicago World's Fair buildings were torn down within months of the fair's closing. The Paris Exposition structures were torn down. The St. Louis World's Fair buildings from 1904, gone. The San Francisco Panama Pacific Exposition from 1915, torn down. Across the world, hundreds of magnificent structures, representing millions of dollars in construction costs and requiring years of effort to build, were purposely destroyed shortly after their construction. The official explanation is that they were temporary structures built for short-term use, but this makes no economic sense whatsoever. The cost to build these structures was huge. The city of Chicago spent $28 million on the 1893 fair, roughly $800 million in today's dollars. Why would you spend that kind of money on buildings you plan to destroy within months? Unless they weren't just buildings. Unless they were proof of a technology and a civilization that needed to be erased.
Official history tells us these were staff buildings, temporary structures made of plaster over wooden frames, never meant to last. But photographs tell a different story, and engineering details that would be unnecessary for temporary buildings. And here's the kicker.
Many of them were simply buried, not torn down, buried. There are documented cases of World's Fair buildings being partially buried under several feet of earth and construction debris. In some cases, entire basements and sub-basements were simply filled in rather than torn down. Why? If these were temporary wooden structures, why not just tear them down? Why go to the huge effort and expense of burying them? Unless there was something about these buildings, something about their construction or their systems that needed to be hidden, something that would raise uncomfortable questions if examined too closely. The pattern extends beyond the World's Fairs. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, cities across America and Europe had huge urban renewal projects. Old buildings were torn down or buried. New structures were built on top of buried city layers. Entire neighborhoods were raised, sometimes by as much as 10 to 15 feet, with the previous ground level simply buried and built over. Seattle did this in the 1890s. Chicago raised its streets by 4 to 8 feet in the 1850s and 60s. Large portions of London sit on top of buried earlier construction. In Rome, Paris, and other European cities, excavations consistently reveal previous street levels and buildings 10 to 20 feet below the current surface. Official explanations cite flooding concerns, infrastructure improvements, and simple urban growth. But the scale and consistency of this burial is striking. It's not just individual buildings or neighborhoods, it's systematic across multiple cities and continents, and it happens to match exactly with the time when these fancy atmospheric power systems were at their peak. What were they burying? And more importantly, why? Let's pull all these threads together and see the bigger picture that emerges. We have buildings across the world having identical design parts, tall metal spires, copper domes, fancy conductor systems, smart water features. We have construction timelines and capabilities that defy official explanations.
We have power requirements that exceed available technology by orders of magnitude. We have purposeful destruction and burial of proof. And we have a historical story that avoids these questions entirely. What we're looking at is proof of a global atmospheric electrical power system that existed in the 1800s and was purposely erased from history. This wasn't basic technology. This was smart engineering that understood principles of atmospheric electricity, resonance, and energy distribution that official science claims wasn't understood until much later. The buildings weren't powered by coal and steam. They were powered by the atmosphere itself, using the Earth's natural electrical field as a continuous energy source. The system worked like this. The tall spires and metal frames acted as collection points for atmospheric electricity. The fancy metal domes and decorative parts increased surface area and conductivity. The fancy water features generated additional electrical charges through the Lenard effect, while also serving as storage and distribution systems. The internal network of metal pipes and conductors shared this power throughout the buildings, and potentially between buildings across city grids. This explains so many oddities that official history glosses over. It explains how huge exhibitions could operate with thousands of lights and mechanical systems, with no proof of adequate conventional power generation. It explains why buildings had such fancy metal decoration at such great expense. It explains the obsessive focus on spires, towers, and vertical parts in 1800s architecture. It explains the integration of water features into virtually every major city structure and exhibition. And it explains why these buildings were destroyed. Because this technology represented something dangerous to the emerging industrial order: free energy, or nearly free energy, harvested directly from the atmosphere. No coal to mine, no oil to drill, no centralized power generation facilities to control. Anyone with the right architecture could potentially tap into the system. The implications were revolutionary and threatening to those who saw profit in centralized, controlled energy distribution. The rise of the petroleum industry in the late 1800s and early 1900s wasn't just about transportation fuel. It was about establishing a controlled, money-making energy system to replace the atmospheric power grid.
Edison's electric company didn't just provide a new form of lighting. It established the model for centralized power generation and distribution that could be metered, controlled, and profited from. But to put in place this new system, the old system had to be erased. Not just physically torn apart, but removed from history and memory. This explains the purposeful destruction of World's Fair buildings. These weren't temporary structures celebrating industrial progress. They were functioning demonstrations of the atmospheric power system, showcasing its capabilities to millions of visitors. They had to be destroyed to get rid of proof of the technology. It explains the urban burial projects of the late 1800s and early 1900s. Entire city blocks with atmospheric power architecture were literally buried and built over with structures designed for the new centralized electrical grid. And it explains the story shift in the early 1900s. Suddenly, the fancy architectural features of the 1800s were made fun of as wasteful and outdated. The modern look of the 20th century got rid of spires, domes, and fancy metalwork in favor of simple, box-like structures. This wasn't just changing fashion, it was getting rid of the architectural parts necessary for atmospheric power collection. Tesla's experiments fit perfectly into this picture. Nikola Tesla was experimenting with wireless power transmission and atmospheric electricity collection in the 1890s and early 1900s. His Wardenclyffe Tower was designed to transmit power without wires, using the Earth's natural electrical potential. Official history tells us he was a visionary ahead of his time, that his ideas were too radical and impractical. But what if Tesla wasn't inventing something new? What if he was trying to recreate and improve upon a system that already existed? What if the atmospheric power grid of the 1800s was what inspired Tesla's work? And what if the suppression of his research was part of the same effort to get rid of this technology from public knowledge? The proof is there, hidden in plain sight, in thousands of photographs, architectural drawings, and historical documents that no one is supposed to look at too closely. The fancy buildings of the 1800s weren't just beautiful architecture. They were functional parts of a global energy system that harnessed the power of the atmosphere itself. And someone decided this technology needed to disappear. So where does this leave us?
What are we supposed to do with this information? The implications are huge. If a smart atmospheric power system existed in the 1800s and was purposely suppressed, it means our entire modern energy setup, the petroleum industry, the electrical grid, nuclear power, is built on the foundation of a made-up scarcity. We've been told for over a century that energy is difficult to generate, expensive to distribute, and inevitably tied to pollution and resource extraction. But what if that's a lie? What if the Earth itself provides abundant, clean energy that can be harvested with the right architecture and understanding? What if the fancy buildings of the 1800s weren't just decoration, but functional technology that we've forgotten how to build? Think about what this means for our present situation. We're told that renewable energy is expensive and difficult, that solar and wind are the only viable alternatives to fossil fuels, that battery storage is the key challenge. But what if we're pursuing the wrong solutions because we've forgotten the right ones? The atmospheric electrical system wouldn't have needed solar panels or wind turbines. It wouldn't have needed battery storage or complex power management systems. It worked continuously, day and night, fair weather and foul, using the Earth's natural electrical field as a limitless power source, and it was purposely erased from history. Here are the questions we need to be asking. Who made the decision to suppress this technology? Why were so many fancy buildings purposely destroyed in the early 1900s? What other technologies from the 1800s have been erased from our historical record? Who benefits from the centralized energy system we have today? Why do we accept the official story that treats obvious architectural power collection systems as mere decoration? Why don't we question the impossible construction timelines and capabilities attributed to the 1800s? Why do we ignore the mathematical impossibilities of the power systems supposedly used at World's Fairs and expositions? The silence is deafening. Official historians, when pressed on these questions, offer vague explanations about architectural fashion and temporary structures. They dismiss the timeline problems as exaggeration in contemporary accounts. They avoid the power generation math entirely, and they never ever discuss the purposeful destruction and burial of proof. Too many coincidences, too many patterns repeating across continents and decades.
Too many impossibilities that we're asked to accept without question. The proof points to a conclusion that official history desperately wants us to avoid. The technology of the 1800s was more smart than we've been taught. The buildings were machines, the architecture was functional, and it was all purposely hidden. What else have we been lied to about? If the power system of the 1800s has been erased, what other technologies have been suppressed? What other capabilities did our ancestors possess that we've forgotten? The buried cities beneath our modern streets might contain more than just old buildings. They might contain proof of an entire technological civilization that's been written out of history. The grand buildings of the 1800s stand as silent witnesses to a truth that official history tries to bury. They're still there, many of them, though stripped of their metalwork and renovated to get rid of the most obvious proof of their function. But look carefully at the old photographs. Look at the spires reaching toward the sky. Look at the fancy water features. Look at the impossible sophistication built in impossible timeframes. And ask yourself, what am I not being told? The Tartarian power system, because that's what it was, a technology of an earlier, more advanced civilization that official history calls Tartaria when it admits its existence at all, wasn't just a curiosity of the past. It was a threat to the controlled, profit-driven energy model that emerged in the early 20th century and dominates our world today. We live on a planet surrounded by an electrical field containing hundreds of thousands of volts of potential energy. We're told we need to burn fossil fuels or split atoms to power our civilization. But the buildings of the 1800s tell a different story, a story of abundant, clean, freely available energy that requires only the right architecture to harness. That story was buried, literally and figuratively. The buildings were destroyed or stripped of their functional parts. The technology was erased from the historical record, and we've been left with an expensive, polluting, controlled energy system that benefits the few at the cost of the many. The truth is written in the architecture. The question is, are we willing to see it?